For a limited time, we're giving away this Canon EOS RP. All you got to do is go to videomaker.com/win, and you can enter there to win this camera. The Canon EOS RP, enter today at videomaker.com/win.
Today on the Videomaker podcast, Chris and I talk all about shooting green screen. So last week we talked about lighting for green screen. This time we're talking all about kind of the camera settings that are involved here. Not only the settings that have to do with the files that you create. So we're talking about the resolution, the color sampling, and the bit depth, but also other things like maybe your lens choice and the framing. So last week we talked about lighting, as I said, and we really do think that lighting is the most important aspect of green screen. Shooting obviously is important. If you're not getting the right files, then you're going to have a hard time. But this actually is probably the easiest portion, frankly. If you get this right, actually getting it right is pretty simple. So regardless, I hope you learned something from it. But I think this is going to be easy for most people, or at least easier than lighting, and certainly easier than post-production. As always, if you've been enjoying the podcast, we'd love it if you went to iTunes and hit the subscribe button, or if you go to Spotify and hit the follow button. It's really a convenient way to get the podcast delivered straight to your mobile device every Monday morning. And actually, one other thing before we get on with the show, I forgot to mention we're giving away still our green screen course called How to Fix Green Screen Problems. You can get that for free by going to videomaker.com/greenscreen, and we'll send you the course there. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Videomaker podcast. I'm Mike Wilhelm, and with me, 2 rooms over, is Chris Monlux.
Hello.
And we're back to talk about more green screen topics. You know, I was thinking about this, Chris. I really hope that everyone wants to hear about green screen, our regular podcast listeners, because we're in it, I guess, right? We're in it now. We got another green screen episode today and another one next week. Then we'll be back to our regularly scheduled topics, I guess.
You know, the thing is, though, about green screen is no matter how many times you do it, there's probably something that you didn't know or you haven't experienced yet, and hopefully we're preparing them for that. A bummer green screen shoot's never good, so it's always good to be as knowledgeable as you can to make sure you have the best outcome.
Yeah, that's right. So last episode, we talked all about lighting, which, you know, we were reflecting after the episode that lighting is really kind of the most complex part of green screen, or rather it's the most complex part if you're doing it right. I think post-production can be pretty dang tricky if your lighting is bad, but lighting is really, you put your energy into lighting and you're probably going to have, you're more likely to have a good experience than if you're trying to put all your energy into post-production or shooting. Yeah,
I mean, just fixing problems. It reminds me of the same of like, if you have brands to cover up, it's so easy to put some gaffers on something, but then in post you have to track it, you have to blur it, and then you have to like blend it into everything. So, it's like a little bit of thought on set will go a long way in post that really didn't need to be happening. And I've had times where I pulled a good key, but then my subject just looked like garbage, and it's like, I'm gonna have to settle for either halfway good key or halfway good looking person. Like you're not gonna get it all, and that's where preparation really goes in. But it's lighting. But then I think there's a lot of shooting things that can help assist make it easier as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk all about shooting today. We have a number of topics related to, how to set up your camera. But actually, one thing I think we should maybe inject in front of this stuff is just like, you kind of hinted at it, right? Preparation. I can't tell you how many shoots I've been on with green screen where I didn't take the proper precautions in readying the talent for a green screen shoot. And they would show up and be wearing the wrong kind of clothes, or their hair is styled, inappropriately. And when I say inappropriate, I don't mean like they shaved obscenities into their hair, but, it's like wild, anyone who's done this knows that, if you've got a lot of kind of hairs that are flying all over the place, that's kind of a big pain.
80s hair metal bands and green screen don't go together. No
Yep,
Twisted
exactly.
Sister in front of the green screen.
Exactly, especially blonde 80s hair metal, right?
Yeah, just this, especially, or like Motley Crue, just the big bangs and stuff. The more wispy hairs you have, the more pain you'll have.
Yeah, exactly. So, the big things to look for obviously are their wardrobe. But, obviously we would avoid anything that's green. And I would go even a little bit further and maybe say avoid white, and maybe avoid yellow even. Anything that's going to interfere with your key. White's obviously tricky because of, lighting spill, or the green spill from the green screen can spill onto the white of clothing and make things really challenging. Yellow can be tricky because sometimes there is a little bit of overlap in the color spectrum between yellow and green. And depending on how much you have to do in post to like expand the range of what you're telling your software green is, the more likely you're going to get into that yellow zone and pick up some clothing.
My rule of thumb is always trying to just contrast as much as you can with, like, obviously black is probably going to be the best contrast,
yes.
right? It's going to be a stark difference. Obviously, I mean, I guess there is green and black. There's every color in black, but that it's going to be the easiest to get to key and stuff, because those two are not going to interfere with each other. You're not going to have this place where your tolerance is just going to be a little bit too great and it's going to take in a color of your outfit, and then now your actor has a missing ear, or whatever it is. Or if they're, I mean, some people I have definitely done key, and someone looked thinner than they did before and they liked it. So that's a nice happy accident there, but you don't really ever want to do that. And when you want a key, you want all your edges nice and crisp. You want it to be really believable, like they're just been placed really nicely in whatever scene you have. You want to fool the audience into thinking they're somewhere they're not. I always think of Wayne's World. I think it's Wayne's World 2, and they're like, "We're in Delaware." All right.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. When they got the green screen.
Yeah, but green screen, and so you can take people, you can go anywhere, and it started out as a weatherman's tool, and I think it's found its way into films you wouldn't even think would employ green screen. It might be somewhere here and there just to help sell the location.
Yeah, you nailed it though with crisp green screen, right? So I love it when I get to key someone who's bald. That makes it really, really, really easy. And then also going back to clothing, you want to make sure people are wearing clothes with sharp lines. It's always a pain if you're going into a green screen shoot and you have someone come in and they have like this translucent shawl or something. It's like you look at this thing or anything with tassels and it's like, wow, my life is going to be pretty lame. When I take this into post. So, nice clothing that has crisp lines is nice.
I have a good story about that. We used to do a commercial, and it was every quarter for a new rodeo. And they always had two girls that worked at the Western store come in and at the end of the video say, "We'll see you there." And they have a party afterwards or something like that. I don't remember what the context of it was. But they always came just all dolled up in their cowgirl outfits and stuff. And one time, one of the girls wore like this, like it was for winter, for like New Year's Eve or something like that. So it had a nice fuzzy like hood on it, and then had all sorts of rhinestones, all like blingy things that of course have all sorts of green in them. So it was like the first time I tried to key it, it was like the girl had been shot. She had so many holes in her. It was bad, and we ended up having to actually reshoot it because it was like we can't make this look good. And you don't wear things like that in the future. But we were at the point not in a relationship with the client enough to be as forward, unfortunately. And that teaches you sometimes it's good to just say something and deal with that on set, because I'm sure she brought more outfits. We weren't willing to say anything about it.
That's one of those things where one of the pieces of or one of the things you want to prep for, or how you want to prep your talent, is bring a few things to wear to try out, right? Like you just can't imagine every possible scenario saying, "Don't wear this, don't wear this." Like who would have thought? Well, you would now, I guess. don't wear rhinestones. Like that wouldn't have even appeared on my radar, you know?
Yeah, I didn't even think about it until you think of like a crystal ball has like every single color in it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And you know, the thing about, you know, you get these experiences in doing those kinds of having those mistakes, and you just don't want to be in those situations. And I think that this is a good place to start with. You know, I mean, it's for us, it was being assertive there, but that, you know, you have a job to do. And so trying to figure out how you can do that on set, that was one of the things we were really learning at the time. But yeah, before you get shooting, it's setting up for those things. And like we said, you know, so you know what they're wearing, you know what they're doing in the scene. So you know the breadth of which their movement is going to be, you know, where you know, the background that they're going to go into. And so now you have to shoot, right? And that's great. And so the thing that I learned, and this is interesting, is that it used to be a lot easier to key in standard definition. Now we're talking back, you know, back in Square TV days. And why is that? Well, there's just fewer pixels to key out. Now, what that also meant is that you used a lot of blur on your edges because you'd have jaggies all over the edge from the key because there's just so few actual pixels there. But that resolution's your friend when doing resolution, a high color sampling, and a high bit depth. Those are all things, and we'll de-jargon that in a second, but that those are all things that the higher the quality you put in, the more flexibility you'll have in post if you have to find different shades of green or hide, you know, a substandard part of your key or whatnot. Do you have anything to add before we jump into talking about those, Mike?
You know, it's kind of unintuitive, the whole idea that less resolution makes things easier. You know, I would say that when I was keying in standard definition and then jump to high definition, I found my life feeling being a little bit better, you know, because of the softness. Like you said, you get jaggies with the standard definition, things get pixelated and the edges are not quite as smooth, so you kind of blur it a little bit. But also there was like issues with interlacing and de-interlacing and then re-interlacing, right? Like whenever you de-interlace standard definition footage, things get a little bit softer. And when things get a little bit softer, you know, it's harder to find the distinction between where one color ends and the next color begins. But yeah, what you're saying makes sense in terms of more pixels means more things to key out. You have more variety of colors and more changes in the colors. And you also have more detail, which you have to consider. Like you were talking about the woman with the fuzzy jacket, right? You can see all the fuzz in high definition or 4K where you wouldn't in standard definition. So I hadn't thought about that, but
surprisingly, in that story, the fuzz was not a big deal. I thought that was the only thing I was concerned with. Yeah, the fuzz actually turned out, but the holes in her didn't look so good. Right. You know, so when I say resolution now, it's great to shoot in, let's shoot in 12K since Blackmagic's got a camera that people could buy for 12K.
Yes.
Now, am I saying produce in 12K? No. So, I mean, I don't know about you, Mike, but I don't think that unless you're a specialist, you're probably shooting outside of, you know, big budget films outside of 4K. We just don't have a lot of delivery that's happening there. Now, I mean, I know a lot of people can be in that space, but the thing is there's not a huge demand for it. So it's not likely you're going to get make more money in that unless that's what you specialize in. But all those pixels are awesome when you think of, let's just say 4K into HD. So you're producing in HD. That you now every pixel in that HD composition. So if you're actually outputting as HD, but you shot it as 4K, now every pixel is 4 times smaller. So same thing, your key, the fine details. Now you have far more sampling of that image through the resolution. And that's the same idea with color sampling. So, you know, color sampling is how a lot of compression happens. And the idea of color sampling is just think of like, if the color next to it's kind of close to it, it goes, oh, we're this color together. You know, it's just a lot of averaging of colors in your scene, and the less color sampling you have, the more averaging there is. So the closer you get to 444, which is every color has its own pixel or the place so it's going to sample that you're going to have that much more detail, which is going to make the key to pull it a lot easier because the gradient can actually be measured and felt in the same thing. And then if you're scaling it down, you're also having that. And then the next thing is even more colors, which would be your bit depth. And your bit depth just allows 8-bit is millions of colors, 10-bit is billions of colors. And so just the amount of colors difference you have, now the more sensitive your key can be and not maybe affect if you had a bunch of compression on a green that averaged into a green that's kind of like the one in your face. You won't have to worry about that because the averaging and the compression isn't going to be working against you in post-production. So if you have a camera that can do those things, that's great. Now, given shooting RAW, shooting 12-bit, shooting high color sampling, all those high resolution require beefy computers, so not everybody can do that kind of thing. And then, of course, not every camera can do those things either. But those are like more of the situations when I would think, oh, I want to bump it up to, if I have a camera that shoots 8-bit, I'm going to bump it up to 10-bit while I'm shooting this. If I have a choice to do 422 instead of 420 color space, I'll do that in this situation. And maybe everything else I won't, because there's no need for that added data or information for everything else. But for a key, you're like, oh, I want to make sure to give myself as much room in post as I can to make this really hold together. And that's, I think, a really kind of unseen. It's kind of the tech side of things. It's like the guy that would set the camera up before you shoot or whatever, whereas, we all wear that hat now. And if you think of, if your camera can do those things, that's the stuff to use it for. If you're just shooting an interview, sure, it's great to shoot in really big data rates and whatnot, but it's probably not necessary in every situation. But in this case, it's going to help you.
Yeah, so something that happens in post, and we're going to talk about post in detail in next week's episode, so I don't want to get too far into it. But something that happens a lot of times is, you'll choose a color green that you want to key out, and it will recognize other pixels that are close to it, depending on your settings, and either get rid of them entirely or replace them. So if it finds that something is on the kind of the periphery, the outside edge of your green, it might go, okay, well, rather than replacing this, we're just going to replace it with like gray. And you get those a lot of times in the skin or on the clothes. And the more color information you have, which is a setting in your camera, hopefully you have these settings, if you give it more data, higher bit depth, if you go up to 10-bit or you're shooting on 422 or 444, the better chance your post-production software is going to be able to draw a distinction between the different shades of green so that you can tell your software, this green actually is quite a bit different from the green that, is kind of in my clothes somewhere or in my skin or in my eyes or something like that. So, and that combined with the fact that you can always compress and bring the quality of your video down. If you're challenged by having to, work with these big files or work with all the resolution or the extra color, you can always transcode it down to something that's more manageable for you. You can never dial it back up. So for all those reasons, I agree, Chris. The thing to do is just set your camera to get as much color information as you can.
Yeah, I think the situation where like almost every green screen shoot I've ever had to deal with is not optimal, right? There's always some kind of give and take you have to do. Yeah. It's just part of the process, and hopefully you made the right choices into what things really matter. And I would say, if you can shoot at a high resolution with a high color sampling or a good color sampling rate, and then a high bit depth, that you're going to have a lot more forgiveness in post when things aren't perfect. So, if you aren't able to bring in more lighting and that stuff. Now, I don't think any of this stuff is going to be nearly as dramatic to how easy a key is if you light right, but they are far better to have those tools at your fingertips when you need them than them not even be an option. It's just one of those things, right? You think about it. I mean, I can't say I've ever done really long form green screen. I really hope I don't. It's just, I'm just not a big fan of green screen because it takes so much effort to make something look real. I always think just let's just shoot something so it looks real. I'm more into like practical sets than placing someone in their set. But when you don't have a choice, or when, you know, you're doing something like a news broadcast or things where it doesn't matter that it's a green screen, it's not trying to say, you know, you're doing a lot of corporate video is really great, because then they can have a, you know, you can have a virtual set that has, you know, motion graphics and all that kind of stuff in it. I mean, there's all sorts of really good reasons, but most of the time it's like, can we work around this? And so you don't want to be stuck. And I think the settings are really going to be there. Now, something that I think I learned pretty early on, and the nice thing about, you know, the higher resolution you get is the more sharpness really you can have, because you have more resolution, right? The more detail there. But of course, you want to make sure that you're in really great focus. So, you know, just like any shot, you know, make sure when you're having to balance, you know, oh, I'm doing a green screen, I got the lighting, I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of that. Don't forget the rudimentaries of like exposing your subject properly, of making sure their eyes are in focus, making sure you don't have too much shallow depth of field, and shallow depth of field actually can help. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that you want to make sure that you're doing all the normal stuff you would for a shot, on top of dealing with the managing of shooting it as a green screen shot. So you still want to give good direction. You still need your audio to sound good. You know, it's just now you have to think of really the edit as you're shooting, and even before you're even shooting, right? So it's definitely a lot of preparation and thought will go a long way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up exposure. I have a little story that hopefully people can learn from. So something you definitely don't want to do is underexpose your subject when you're shooting, because what happens is you try to brighten them up, and you're sort of bringing up the midtones to be at kind of the highlight level, but you're trying to leave the blacks where they are, and you get just some crazy noise and whatnot, just digital artifacting, which is like, you know, the blotchy, blocky
dancing black
image. Yeah, exactly. Which makes keying really, really difficult. So I learned this the hard way, because I was scheduled for a shoot. I found out last minute we needed to do a green screen. This was early in my career, and I didn't have a green screen. So I thought, well, I'm going to go down to the fabric store, and I'm going to buy a big chunk of green. Not knowing much about green screen and all that, I went down and I bought a big chunk of fabric. Turns out the fabric was a little brighter than your normal green screen. And in order to expose the green properly, the subject was underexposed. So the lesson learned here is, when you are choosing the green screen itself, the actual color of the green and the brightness of the green is pretty important, because you got to make sure the green itself is exposed properly. And if you want your subject and your green screen to be exposed both properly, obviously they're both on camera at the same time, they have to be the proper brightness. Just generally, you can't have a really bright colored green, because that's like almost yellow or something, because you know, you need to dial your exposure back, which underexposes your subject. Or likewise, if you have a very dark green, you can't just expose up, because then you overexpose your subject. So the tip here is get yourself a green screen that's made for green screen shooting. It's going to be the right color.
Now, when you were doing that, Mike, were your lights dimmable, or were they a full strength all the time?
They were dimmable in the sense that they were incandescent lights, which I could have put a dimmer on, but I was young and naive, and I didn't know how to do that. The best thing I could do was back them off.
Yeah, the answer, I'd say most of the time, I mean, I don't think the green matters as much as you would need then more light on your subject to match the luminous. What you want is to normalize so that you aren't having to overexpose something or underexpose something, just to get one or the other right. And that's true for, I mean, like a shot that has nothing to do with green screen, that's in the sun, and for whatever reason your subject's in a shade, your camera doesn't have that much dynamic range, and it's heaven behind them. There's no details. It's just all sorts of blown out just to get the people. So, you know, to answer that, you'd have to pretty much, you know, scorch your subjects so they get illuminated enough that the background doesn't, or, you know, turn the sun down. You can't do it in that situation. But in lighting, that's a lot of times the balance is like, how much contrast does my subject have to the background? And it's like, it should be below what your subject should always be the thing you're trying to expose properly for. And then you want to make sure the background is, not too illuminated so that they are underexposed, or that the background would be overexposed, because an overexposed area on green screen, you do not want to have to deal with like, when you're pulling a key and having to pull them out of highlights, because it's just going to really affect skin tone. And I think that most people, if they think about green screen, or if they've done green screen, that's really the biggest thing you're trying to get out of any scene. Is just, I want to make sure my subject looks normal, and then of course fits in the scene. But like a lot of times you just have to accept, I want them to not look bad, because you have to do that balance. And, the cool thing is like, if you have a camera now, we have a lot of, like if you're shooting with a video camera, you might not have as many choices. And cinema cameras surely have lots of choices as far as data rates and all the rest. Is you're also going to get more dynamic range usually in those higher like sampling, color samplings and bit depths. So because of that, you're not going to have as much worry about the brights and darks, because they're going to be in a range that's more controllable. But not every camera is that way. Most DSLRs shoot really compressed, or DSLRs and mirrorless really compressed 420, H.264s that are 100 megabits per second. So they're pretty small data rates, and there's just not a lot of information there. So, if you can't shoot it and be good with what you see, it's surely not going to be able to get any better in post. So if you're dealing with a really compressed medium, I would say the pressure is even more on for you to make sure it looks good when you're shooting it than to ever think you're going to be able to correct it in post, because you're just really going to be lost for information. And it's no good when you're so close to having something right, yet your correction is making something else wrong. And you just don't want that.
Yep. So Chris, let's talk just a little bit about framing. And actually I'm going to throw in here as well, maybe focal length. So framing, first off, I guess it's important to make sure your subject covers, or the green screen, covers your subject, and that's kind of in reverse because your green screen is behind your subject. But we talked a little bit about this last week, the idea that you want to make sure that your subject is not moving outside of the coverage of the screen itself. But what advice would you give shooters about how to frame up their subject properly?
Well, again, I think it goes back to where you're putting them, right? So, if you intend someone to be head to toe in a scene, don't shoot a medium shot, that kind of stuff. So they actually exist in the scene. Remember a close up with a green screen, there's just, you're going to need to make sure you understand the size difference between your subject and your background and where they're going to sit in the space. And that once you identify that, you now know the freedom you have to frame your subject. So if I'm framing a subject and I don't really know, I have an idea maybe what the background I'm going to have. I've had plenty of times where we had to do just green screen and hope we could put something in the background that would work right. But that if you're able to put them in the center of your screen, because it's green screen, you're going to be able to move them around. So if they're in the center of your screen, they might have more arm movements, more space in that way. And so if you do have to end up putting them not where you intended them, that they have enough movement to which they don't find the edge of the screen. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. As soon as you hit the edge of the frame, and when the actual shot that was green screen is scaled down, all of a sudden you have an arm, cut off or whatever it is. I guess it's kind of like the framing I got now, which those that are listening to us can't tell that. But if I go outside it, you just can't see my hands. So that's an issue there. And I, just plan with that in mind. And the cool thing about that is if you know their movements, you also then now know that you might not need green screen outside of those movements. You might be able to move your lights to a position that they better illuminate. And yeah, they block some of the green screen, but that's not in the shot that the part of the shot you're going to use. So it doesn't matter. So there's, if you know the composite they're going into, you can cheat a little bit and get a little more room. And if if your subject is going to be tight, don't shoot them really wide, because now you got to get them really big and you're going to lose resolution and all the rest there. So just knowing what they're going into, what is really awesome, and this is what they have on set, is actually real-time compositing, right? Is you're actually able to see the key live, just like they do on the news, and he can look and see what the weather is going to be in whatever the city is. But that's going to help the subject know how to interact with their background, but most people aren't going to be able to do that in real time. So what I would do is do test shots, do some stuff that just proves your concepts of what you're going to be doing. So even if it's not your final subject, do some tests with them in that scene. Take it to your computer, key it out, see how easy that key was, see if you can learn something from it to move your lights around or change your settings on your camera, whatever it is. Doing a little bit of that when you can. I mean, it might even be bring a laptop on location that has your editing software, so you can test your key, because it'll go a long way. You'll really learn something really quick with how where you need to improve, because it's no good if you needed to improve and you don't see it until you're actually at the point where you're keying it, and now you're like, do we reshoot? Does that guy need has the guy had a haircut since the last time he was on camera? All those things that end up being a problem with consistency in your shooting, if you could just capture it in the first place at the time you're supposed to.
Yeah, I think one of the main things, at least with framing, that people should remember is you really don't have to fill the frame with green. Like Chris, you were saying that if your light stand is in the shot, well, that's okay, right? The idea behind green screen is you're cutting out a bunch of what's going on, and as long as your subject isn't overlapping with those things, you can just crop them out, or mask them out if you're doing something. If you want to draw, a very tight mask around your subject, you can have all kinds of things in the shot. The green doesn't need to go all the way to the edge. You're just cutting it off. Just crop it out. When we were using the TriCaster, we did this all the time. We would set up a green screen, and even if the green went all the way to the edge, we would still crop out the sides, because you don't need that space. If your subject isn't, flailing around or anything, you don't need it. So why bother having your computer, or in our case, the TriCaster, constantly trying to key it out? When there could be blotches, right? Shadows, you name it.
Yeah, that's I garbage mat, which is just doing a rough mat around cropping out your subject on all keys, regardless if there's something else in the shot. And the reason why is you just don't have as much green you got to get rid of. I mean, it's exactly. And so in our lighting setup, we talked about being real even with your background light, and that really just matters in the area that that's actually behind it. Now, here's a little tip. One, if you're using a backdrop of any kind, make sure there aren't wrinkles in it. Steamer works really well for that. Wrinkles are hard to deal with. So like if you have to sandbag or whatnot, realize that there's a little bit of balancing you got to do there. But that shallow depth of field will go a long way for you. It softens up a lot of those things. It also will help kind of marginalize or average out some of the colors and stuff in the background, because they'll be more blurred out. So, it'll expand over more than just what it normally would. And then it also usually gives you a nice crisp edge, because your subject matter's in focus and there's actually defocus behind them. And that ends up being a really big benefit. So, the depth of field that you have, you want to make sure that it fits the scene, right? If all of a sudden your eyes are in focus but the ears aren't, and you're putting into the scene where the background's in focus, that ain't gonna work. So you got to make sure your depth of field is matching in the scene, just like the color and the lighting and all the rest. And so I think that's really really important. And one thing Mike actually hit on earlier that I think we're getting pretty close to need to be done here, but that what focal length you choose to use will help you bring the background closer to your subject through a thing called space compression. Yes. And space compression happens when you're using a telephoto lens, a lens that is longer than 50 millimeter, because that's about your average. And we actually have this a little bit at that. But the idea is, if you've ever seen the moon on a horizon in a picture, and the moon's just ginormous, That's space compression. So it's actually bringing the moon closer and flattening the background so that it brings it closer so it looks bigger. So if you use a longer focal length, like a 200 millimeter on a stand-up, that you are that 2-to-1 ratio, which we said in the last podcast, which was if you want to have your subject twice as far away from your background as they are to the camera. That's just a rule of thumb. It's not really, just start there. That if you're able to zoom in and make the screen now come more forward, now you don't need that really big screen, but you need a lot of space. And that's the big difference is, you might have to back up your camera a bunch and then zoom in on your subject matter. And the things to pay attention to there is your camera locked down, because every little movement now feels like an earthquake. And, does your subject have enough area to move and whatnot? And are they in focus? Because the other thing that space compression does is it also affects your shallow depth of field. And so you want to make sure they have enough movement in their shot that the depth of field isn't working against you.
Yeah. Last tip on that is, if assuming you have the space, a lot of times people have this inclination to use a zoom lens, because of that more narrow field of view makes it easier for the green to fill the background. Whereas, if you put a big fisheye lens on it, your green screen kind of like shrinks up in terms of the proportion of the screen that it takes up. But the more zoom you use, kind of sometimes the more unflattering your subject looks, right? Because of the space compression that Chris mentioned. What result that has is, the whole thing about the camera adding 10 pounds, right? It sort of flattens out and smushes people's faces, and it gets away from the sort of natural focal length of, or field of view or what have you of, 35 to 50 millimeters. So, depending on who you're shooting, you might be extra precautious about using those zoom lenses if you think that your talent is going to be overly concerned about looking like they added a few pounds.
Like here, the guy with the big nose, he's going to be happy you did it.
Yes.
Or the girl with the big forehead, she's going to be happy you did it, because it's going to make those seem smaller. But then the person that was just a little overweight, now it might be a little bit over exaggerated, just because we aren't as wide as our widest spot, but we might end up looking that way because of space compression.
Yes, exactly. So we have a number of additional tips about green screen, but they mostly involve post-production. So I think we're going to stop there, and we'll be back next week to talk all about how to actually pull the key once it's into your computer. And again, if you missed our last podcast, I encourage you to go back and listen to it if you're interested in green screen, where we're talking about lighting, aka the most important element of green screen, at least in my opinion. So thanks for everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Big thanks to everyone for listening. Hope you learned a lot. Hopefully you are going to go to videomaker.com/greenscreen, take advantage of the free course we're giving away. As a reminder, next week we're going to talk about post-production for green screen. And if you missed it, be sure to go back and listen to our podcast from last week about lighting for green screen. Most important aspect, really, really important. If you're not familiar with how to light green screen, recommend you go and listen to that episode. So, as always, if you enjoy the podcast, we'd love it if you went to iTunes and gave us a 5-star review. It's a really big help for podcasts like ours, especially niche podcasts like ours. It helps us to get a lot of visibility in the iTunes store. So would love it if you gave us a 5-star review. So for Chris Monlux and everyone here at Videomaker, I'm Mike Wilhelm, and you've been listening to the Videomaker podcast.